Matthew.
How you doing, Mark?
Good, good. So this is Mark Goldberg with UN Dispatch.
Oh, and this is Matthew Lee from InnerCityPress.com at the UN.
At the UN, where sort of Clooney mania has seized the building. Is that right?
It is true. There was a scrum. He came yesterday and did. He was going to do more, but he ended up doing a press conference. But outside the press conference room, literally the hall was filled with UN staff and interns trying to. It got violent. A reporter was thrown to the ground. There was the different distinctions of resident correspondent and outside reporters. They made a big distinction of who could go in the room and who couldn't. And then they locked us in, actually, at the end of the press conference so that we wouldn't, I guess, surge forward and
pummel him afterwards.
Yeah, no, it was quite... And then all day he was around the building. I mean, this is the hype side of it, but he stayed around, and to his credit, to promote peacekeeping and hopefully a better solution in Darfur. He was doing a lot of interviews, but he was very kind of stealth. He would sort of like appear in the basement, and there'd be like, whee! People start running there. Then he went out a side door, and Fox took him somewhere else, and he went, So it was a whole kind of there was a crew of people that were trying to find him throughout the building. As we usually chase people for like a story, this was like Clooney sightings,
The cameras following him around. And he was nominated or appointed, I should say, as the UN ambassador for peace, an honorary position. Is that correct?
I don't know if he's one of. They have more than one. He's a messenger, and there's actually a distinction. He's not an ambassador. He's a messenger of peace with a particular focus on peacekeeping.
Okay.
That's their very. It's like the goodwill ambassadors are for like UNICEF and stuff. That's like Jane Goodall. She's a goodwill ambassador.
Okay.
Anyway,
I don't know. All the power to him, in my opinion. What do you?
Oh, I don't. You think I'm a? You may think that I'm a cynic. I really actually was. I was sort of impressed by how he spoke yesterday because he was very. It's not his fault if like people follow him through the building, or if I actually think that the UN DPKO itself is sort of starstruck, and the measure of that. It's not to go negative. There was an event. He was supposed to yesterday. They had tried to get him to brief not the Security Council, but troop contributing countries in a kind of a closed-door meeting that's usually done by experts. And his appearance got canceled based on at least two member states saying he's not an expert, he's a movie star. And I think they could have finessed that. He's not an expert, right? And he's the first one to say it. But they could have somehow. I think if they'd shown the countries their props or done some other format, but they just were sort of like, he's George Clooney, you must want him. And Russia, I can say that because I have it on 4 or 5 sources. Russia said we don't want him. Not we don't want him. They thought it was a bad precedent to allow in sort of because in a way it's related to the Kosovo thing. They're real sticklers on who gets a place at the table in formal Security Council debates.
And would have, if Clooney were allowed to speak, would he have sort of singled out, troop contributing countries who aren't necessarily contributing the right equipment or the proper equipment?
I don't actually think so. Given what he said at the press conference, he was extremely diplomatic, which I think at least at the beginning of his his mandate, I think it's smart. I think he's not. He doesn't. If he wanted to just say, China and Russia are no good, he can do that from outside the UN. I think he probably, if they haven't told him to sort of take it easy, he really approached it with a sort of like, he's here to learn. People tried to ask him about Lebanon and other hot spots around the world, and he said, I'm not an expert in that. He didn't claim to be an expert on Darfur, but he had just come back. He went with on a DPKO whirlwind tour to Sudan, Chad, and Democratic Republic of the Congo. So he really limited himself to those areas, which again I thought that was sort of smart, and he didn't. Both in the press conference and afterwards, he didn't. He really went out of his way not to single countries out and to say. He said China's been helpful. I mean, he's sort of turning into a diplomat. I'm sure down the road, some of his supporters might think he's gone soft on the issue. But
I feel like he has a good line on this. He says, cameras are going to follow me wherever I go. Might as well go to places where the press usually doesn't, like Darfur or Chad. And they seem to follow. They follow him around. He sheds light on issue by virtue of being there.
Sure.
For example, Darfur got a mention, in the news yesterday because Clooney was at the UN. So it helps.
I think he'll end up seeing if he really. I think he could do. It's not to, again. It's apples and oranges, but then he should go to Somalia. I mean, I'm not saying Darfur may well deserve more coverage, but as Of the various armed conflicts in Africa, it gets much more coverage than several others.
Agreed. And actually, we had a post on UN Dispatch that I did not write. One of a guest poster wrote, saying essentially that Somalia is the forgotten Darfur in a way,
totally.
And that the name of the official escapes me, but a UN official said, yesterday or the day before that the humanitarian crisis in Somalia is now sort of outpacing Darfur.
I think it's
urgency.
Objectively, there's absolutely no question of it, and I think it's probably John Holmes, the OCHA guy. He's been saying that, the humanitarian affairs highest official. He's been saying that for a while, and I would actually, maybe this is I don't want to go on a sidetrack here, but I believe in part it's because many of the victims in Somalia, the civilians that are being uprooted by this essentially Ethiopian occupation of the country, are not only Muslims but are perceived to be rather fundamentalist Muslims, perhaps having supported the Islamic courts. And so I think I can't help but think that in part, the world. I mean, again, maybe we said this before, and I don't mean to be a cynic, but the U.S. has been looking at Sudan more than other African countries all the way back to the North-South conflict, which was portrayed here as Muslims versus Christians and animists. Right? And so, again, we don't. That's not to say that what's happening in Darfur isn't terrible, but I think when you compare, so I think, he's interested in Darfur, and the UN's credibility is on the line there. So it's good that he went there.
Yeah, no, I think so. Next topic is Gaza.
I'm sorry. There's a Clooney / corruption connection that I have to make. And then we'll definitely go to Gaza.
Please, no, by all means.
No, I'm sorry to say that. And it's something that we've discussed before.
I didn't realize George Clooney was corrupt.
No, it's a Clooney
he
corruption
sounded so
connection.
dreamy the way you described him.
Here's two answers that he gave at the press conference, which I know are. It's very selective that I'm choosing these two answers, but I was impressed by them. One, he was asked, and he was apparently had been prepared that he was going to be asked about the UN's $250 million no-bid contract with Lockheed Martin. And as soon as the question was asked, he was nodding his head. And his first thing out of his mouth is, I'm not a fan of no-bid contracts. Mistakes were made, but I think we've been learning. And this is, in a way, this is an issue that's something that no UN official, even after the General Assembly criticized the way the contract was given, nobody has said mistakes were made. Everyone has said it's fine, it was legal, the SG approved it, and I think it was. In a way, to kind of make a long story short, ironically, the Secretariat, whether it's Ban Ki-moon or Jane Hall-Lute, who runs field support of peacekeeping, or the head of peacekeeping, Jean-Marie Guénaud, it doesn't seem that they reacted to the General Assembly's critique of how they do business. Whereas a single word, sadly, from George Clooney makes them snap and take attention. Now Jane Hall-Lute has offered to come and do a briefing. She didn't say mistakes were made, but she said we've learned lessons. And so, personally, I think that, this may be too inside baseball for you, but as much as George Clooney, because George Clooney can get cameras in Darfur with or without the UN, isn't it true? George Clooney's a star, doesn't need the UN.
But cameras and George Clooney is not going to solve Darfur. I think Clooney rightly believes that it's up to peacekeepers to.
No, I didn't mean to solve it. You had said this thing that it was a benefit, that he might cameras follow him, so he might as well go to Darfur. But I actually think he could. Maybe I'm being naive, and I stand to be corrected. But some blindnesses, even on the UN's part, this is an outside figure they've aligned with that they have so much either respect for or sort of interest in. That honestly, he has more voice with the powers that be at the UN than the GA does, which is very sad. Okay.
Well, and clearly, I think that the lesson is he reads innercitypress.com.
Right. I think actually, believe it or not, I believe DPKO told him you're going to be asked this. I'm sure they didn't like his answer because they would have wanted him to say we did what we had to do, and instead he said, I think maybe it's because of Lockheed Martin and the way that sort of resonates in. He also was wearing an Obama 08 bracelet. I just want to note this for the record.
He was interesting,
and although he declined
that's actually a little. I think that's probably not. Now I'm a huge Clooney fan in art and in life, but I think that probably might pose a problem. I don't think a representative at the UN should be wearing a bracelet.
He didn't answer
supporting any candidate.
I know it was very subtly done. He didn't answer the "Who do you support?" question in the press conference, but he did sort of raise his sleeve. Okay. But here's the other things. He was asked about, which maybe you think it was. Some people think it was in politics that he was asked about allegations of sexual abuse and exploitation by peacekeepers and what not he would do about it, but what he thought about the issue. And he said, it's serious, but this was all in the past, and we've gotten over it. And I think in that he stands to be, he's not ill-informed. Maybe in U.S. media there was a big frenzy a couple of years ago about DR Congo and sexual abuse and exploitation. But this is, again, it's a big peacekeeping force. But there have been peacekeepers in Haiti repatriated to Sri Lanka, peacekeepers in Cote d'Ivoire sent back to Morocco, all in the last few months. So I think this is, and again, it's not to say the main gist of his work should be solving the world's problems with the help of UN peacekeeping. But if he's going to be fronting for them, I think he sees and seems to acknowledge a responsibility to do whatever he can, even if it's just a stray comment, to try to say, pull up your boots and no big contracts. Let's see.
Interesting. Good. Well, it sounded like a fun day.
Clooney mania. Yeah, it really was. And it's sort of like people were literally, even the journalists. The place was abuzz yesterday.
Yeah, I think he has that effect on people. So you want to talk about sort of Gaza and how sort of the building you're in is now we have to get all serious.
Yeah.
How the building you're in right now is sort of reacting to unfolding events there.
Yeah, they're talking, and I think it's sad. It really was. Nobody knows whether it was all just kind of kabuki theater. They ended up with, people have seen on the TV screen the blockade by Israel, people breaking down the wall to go into Egypt, hospitals with their lights turned off. On the other hand, the issue of rockets being fired into the towns in southern Israel. But the Security Council spent many meetings over the last 10 days, probably met 8 times on it. And not even to do a resolution because they could never pass it, but to do what's called a presidential statement. Essentially, all 15 members agreed to a 5-paragraph bloviation, which says we express concern, we note with concern, and they couldn't. In the initial stages of it, the U.S. was isolated. It's sort of like the initial draft said, we're concerned about Israel's blockade and it should end, and we note the missiles as well. The U.S. said that wasn't enough, that it wasn't balanced enough in terms of saying that Israel had only done this because of the missiles, right?
Right.
So there was a time in this process where it was like 14 against 1, and the one was the United States. Then, genius of diplomacy, the U.S. became part of a 14-1 majority, with the holdout being Libya, and that's where things died off. And it literally was.
Sorry. What was the switch? Sorry, how did that switch happen?
The switch was all in the wording of how much weight to give to the missiles. Because Israel's position is that because, they would say Hamas, terrorists, fire these relatively low-tech, but I don't want to be dismissive, they're obviously frightening, missiles from the Gaza Strip into Israel. That is why Israel blockaded even oil, fuel, and humanitarian goods getting into Gaza.
Okay.
So the question of the Arab group and many of the sort of developing world countries basically just wanted a statement that said Israel is wrong to be blockading. But the U.S.
Unqualified.
Yeah, unqualified. I think everyone knew that the rockets were going to be in. The question was how much. Were you going to make a causal connection and say Israel only did it because of the rockets, but they should still stop? See what I mean?
Yeah.
The Israeli ambassador Gillerman came and he said very openly he didn't want the Security Council to issue any statement. He doesn't think it's any of their business. They are defending their country just like any country has a right. He had a really good line, actually, that I don't want to forget to say because it was funny. He said they had a debate, and the Libyan ambassador, who was the president this month, called what Israel is doing genocide. So that was a little overheated, and you're not supposed to say that here. So Gillerman took the floor, and he said, isn't it something, the country who brought us Lockerbie lecturing us about genocide? And then he said, all I can say is TGIF. And this was like Wednesday, so it wasn't Friday. And everyone was like, what are you talking about? And then he said, thank God it's February. Meaning, Libya is no longer the president of the council. That was the best line of the week. Gillerman, our joke is maybe some of these striking comedy writers went to work for the Israeli mission, because that material was that was unheard of. It was
Yeah.
Smoking.
He seized you. What's your impression of the effectiveness of sort of Israel's mission at the UN? I mean, it seems to me that they, to a certain extent, see their job there as making sure that sort of the hostile states don't gang up on them diplomatically through these, oftentimes meaningless resolutions.
Right. No. They're definitely. They fight a defensive game, but they fight it with. I mean, they're very. I think they're very effective at what they do. Actually, I mean, I know people. Many of the journalists I hear, they're like, "Oh, Gillerman." Somebody said to me after I praised his joke, like, "Gillerman's a liar," and all. It's like he's doing his job, and I think he does it. I mean, I don't think no matter how diplomatic he was, they're not going to get a lot of traction. They're not going to pass a lot of resolutions like everyone loves Israel.
Yeah.
So he's very combative, but I think he's very articulate. He sort of like Bolton, actually, to go back, in terms of stripping out the ideology of it. He doesn't hide from the press. He doesn't, if you want to know what Israel thinks, he's going to tell you, you know?
Yeah. It just seems that sort of Israel's on the receiving end of a lot of these resolutions or attempts at resolutions, but at the end of the day, these things are kind of teethless.
Oh,
meaningless.
Totally.
And so you just wonder, sort of, is he kind of wasting his time pushing back against them, or is it central
I think,
to his mission to do that?
I mean,
do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. I think sometimes they're but I think at the Security Council, I very much understand it, because they think, for example, even the Gaza presidential statement, they think that it's a bad precedent. They basically feel that it's none of the Security Council's business. And if they start letting, without opposition, presidential statements sail through, the next thing you know, you're going to have a resolution coming down on them, telling them under Chapter 7 you must stop something. Or, I mean, if some of the countries had their way, they would impose arms embargoes on Israel, right? I mean, so I understand I'm not saying, I understand their approach. Maybe this may even be a segue. Sadly, the Gaza problem goes on, but it's maybe about a month ago, so I don't know if we mentioned it or not, but after that Annapolis, Bush sponsored peace confab in Maryland.
Yeah.
Ambassador Khalilzad of the United States, blithely, anyway, he proposed in the council what seemed to be an innocuous thing, noting and supporting the Annapolis process for the council to pass.
Okay.
And suddenly Israel appeared and said, we don't want you to pass anything about this. It's not a Security Council matter. And Khalilzad in the United States had to withdraw something. Everyone laughed because the idea is that the U.S. is very much conferring with and not, I don't want to, carrying Israel's water, but for example, on this PRST, they were very much carrying Israel's points about the missiles, about, they even tried.
Yeah.
So the segue here, I guess, is people are starting to wonder, there's a couple of other slip-ups of Khalilzad. Are these slip-ups, or is he an incredibly sophisticated player that is actually representing his own foreign policy and not that of President Bush?
Here's another segue towards the same end.
Yep.
About a month ago, I received this sort of a bizarre anonymous tip telling me that he had heard, or he or she had heard, I don't know the source of this tip, that Khalilzad was sort of absenting himself from votes on Israel because he had plans and illusions to run for president of Afghanistan. Now, I didn't move on. This just sounded ridiculous to me, and it still seems ridiculous to me that Khalilzad would even countenance running for president of Afghanistan. But then this past week, Newsweek wrote a story saying just that, saying that sources around Khalilzad are speculating that he might want Karzai's job. And this was Newsweek reporting it. Again, it seems ludicrous and absurd to me. Not to mention a little offensive. I mean, he's a naturalized American citizen. I don't think we should second guess the fact that he's pursuing American interests at the UN.
Yep.
But it just seems shocking to me to see this story appear in Newsweek.
No, there was a Washington Post sort of blind item. This guy Al Kamen, or whatever his name is, he wrote one saying,
in the loop,
the rumors about in the UN, and although Khalilzad sort of issued a denial, the rumor persists, and the rumor still does persist. In fact, it gets even more nitty-gritty than just, and it's true, during this whole Gaza thing, there's a reason that he wasn't here, but he wasn't the one speaking for the U.S. There's this guy called Alejandro Wolf, who's the number 2. He did all the speaking for the U.S. on Gaza. But the nitty-gritty is this is only relevant because of the Khalilzad angle. There had been proposed to be a super envoy to Afghanistan who would represent the United Nations, the EU, and NATO. A British guy, Sir Paddy Ashdown. His name was floated. The UN definitely was in support of him, and it's said that Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, rejected this guy. Not so much the guy as the idea of there being a super envoy who would speak for all 3 outside forces. And the theory is that, and I think this is pretty much true, it either offends their sovereignty or it offends Karzai to have a total counterbalance of power. Like, who would be more powerful in Afghanistan then, Paddy Ashdown or Karzai? But the real scuttlebutt that people say is that Khalilzad himself, although it was U.S. policy to support Paddy Ashdown, was through stealth ways also opposing him. And again, the theory would be is if he became president, he wouldn't want this counterbalance. Nobody can prove what he wants. I've seen him at the stakeout say he's going to go back to private whatever in the United States, and it would be a very dangerous job. It's hard to, I think he's probably doing fine. The will to power is unfathomable, but.
I mean, he's a high-ranking American official. I just think that it's a little preposterous to think that he would run to be the head of state of another country.
I thought so too. I mean, I still think so. But I asked a guy that I really respect, who's from the South Asian region, has reported from Afghanistan. Actually, is a reporter for newspapers in Afghanistan, and he said Khalilzad is very popular there. It's weird, and it would be.
Sure,
he said. I mean, I don't know who does polling right now in Afghanistan, so I'm really basing this off one guy that knows the country pretty well. But he said it's not ridiculous. It's ill-considered because it would just confirm that the U.S. is trying to take the country over. Right. But in terms of polling data, he said, to the degree that they're really polling in Kandahar between,
Yeah.
But so,
I guess the other Khalilzad flare-up this week was when he was in Davos, and on a panel, I think moderated by, I believe, Gareth Evans of the International Crisis Group.
That's correct.
He sat in a panel, and next to him sitting in the panel was an Iranian official. And, as I said on the foreign policy blog, we all know that the Iranians have cooties, and so Khalilzad gotten a minor amount of trouble from some sort of more of the hardline elements in his own party and in his own White House. Has there been any sort of blowback?
Oh, no. Well, people, there was a journalistic blowback. Because Khalilzad, he's in town today at something at Columbia, but he hasn't actually appeared at the UN for more than a week now.
Okay.
So there hasn't, but people, this is sort of it's a new media side, that there were reporters there at the event in Davos who didn't realize the significance of Khalilzad being there with the Iranians. And so either didn't write a story about it or wrote a story not noting it. And it took reporters in the U.S. seeing it on YouTube to put two and two together, call the State Department and see if he was authorized, and find out that he wasn't. So that's a kind of an interesting thing. I think there it's hard. He's unless we're wrong, he probably doesn't have any chance of being the president of Iran. So it's hard to imagine. I don't understand that it would really be freelancing on this. It's one thing to fall into a kind of an intra State Department dispute between hardliners and non-hardliners, like about North Korea. The Afghanistan allegations are that he's pursuing his own foreign policy. This one is sort of like, it's hard to imagine. He's not that he wouldn't have gotten some kind of green light to sit there.
Well, it just also seems absurd that this is an issue at all.
Right.
That he can't sit next to someone in a conference. I mean, are we children?
Right.
It's a little ridiculous.
Well, there's a lot. I mean, I agree, but I guess that's the I mean, what? I forgot one thing about and I'm not even. This is just a factoid, but I think to a blogging head's audience, it may be of interest. During the Gaza debate,
yes,
even though nothing ended up being done after a week of debate, Barack Obama wrote a letter to Khalilzad. I don't know if you know about this one. He wrote a letter. Wrote a letter to Khalilzad saying, and when I'm so naive that I'm sitting at the stakeout, somebody says, "Oh, Obama's letter," and I'm assuming that it's going to be some statement of like, please open the gates so the lights turn on in hospitals. No, the purpose of the letter is to say, if the U.S. agrees to any statement on Gaza, it must include a denunciation of Hamas.
Yeah.
So this again, I don't know how to characterize it. It's just to sort of.
Well, it speaks to a fundamental political dynamic we have here in the United States, where the major candidates, the major Democratic candidates, and the major Republican candidates, really are united in their position on Israel. There isn't much daylight really between them. It's just sort of the American foreign policy consensus. And to be elected, you can't not be pro-Israel in the sense of being sort of hardline against the Palestinian.
But it was
elements.
to reach out and send that letter and then publicize it. I mean, it appeared first in a newspaper in Israel. Is again, I've had various discussions with people about it. I was surprised, but I guess it's true. Somebody said this actually grew out of some story that of a mentor pastor of his in the Chicago area that had somehow been seen as supporting Farrakhan.
There was this ridiculous article in the Washington Post by Richard Cohen, saying that sort of Obama somehow had to answer for
his mentor's views.
Let me see, it was his pastor's daughter ran a magazine that once interviewed Farrakhan. I'm pretty sure that was mentioned. And you had Richard Cohen of the Washington Post saying, like Obama has. Oh, what about Obama's Farrakhan connection?
Right.
Come clean on Farrakhan.
No, but the thing is that may be a ridiculous article, but that may explain this letter. I mean, that's a number of people that I saw here said that's why he wrote the letter.
Bolster his
Hillary didn't like that letter.
Israel
Not that she doesn't have those beliefs. I know that's an aside, but before we move, it's at the cusp of Khalilzad and Gaza, so
Yeah,
it happens.
Well, it's all connected.
It's a real fact. Yeah.
So I guess moving along, maybe.
Sure. Out in the real world, there's
out in the real world.
Well, we can always turn it into a State Department scuttlebutt. But people are killing it.
Right.
There's death and destruction in Kenya following a disputed election result.
Yes.
The U.S. I can't. The U.S.'s Africa expert Jendai Fraser was there early in the process and went out of her way to say this is not genocide and it's irresponsible to use. Somebody said it's tending toward that. She went back more recently and has said this is clearly ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
So this is is it numbers or is it the fact that it's coming out that these are not just like rampaging youths in the street. It's
organized
and
violence,
people are being driven off land and
there was a second opposition leader killed yesterday. Yep. Their numbers are dwindling. Meanwhile, Kofi Annan is in Nairobi along with Ban Ki-moon.
Sure,
today.
I know.
This week. Working towards the same end of forging some sort of political settlement to the crisis. Were you hearing anything about sort of any impact or results from Ban's trip?
I think what people here were saying. To be honest with you, people were saying, wow, Kofi might be able to solve it, and that would make Ban look bad. This is something I heard. This is not me. That seems like the least of it in terms of comparing two SGs. I think in a way, what's interesting. I mean, obviously, Annan showing up. There was temporarily a lull in violence, as both Kibaki and Odinga said. Their supporters shouldn't be violent in the streets. There seems to be a split. I mean, what's interesting, very recently is countries like Canada and Australia are starting to say, until this is resolved, they're not going to deal with Kibaki like he's the president. They're not going to have business as usual because Kibaki was the president, then he was behind in the polls, then he claimed to win the election. He wants to set up a process where it's like he's still in charge. Maybe he shares a bit of power with Odinga. Odinga's like, you have to redo the election. And a lot of it matters. Where the rubber meets the road is it's like international legitimacy. Who is recognizing the Kibaki government? And you're starting to see some major, both aid donors and countries, start treating it as who knows who's legitimately the leader. In the midst of this, the UN the Financial Times, much to their credit, obtained and published a memo from the World Bank in Kenya, saying that they had been advised by the UN Development Program experts who actually supposedly assisted with the election but then claimed that they couldn't vouch for the results if they'd been stolen or not. Behind closed doors, UNDP told the World Bank, Kibaki won, he's in power, he's our guy. And then all hell broke loose because the idea is that is the UN supposed to be, if that's their position, then say it openly, And then you'll find on UNDP's website, they said, we never vouched for any election. So it's sort of, I think a lot of it is, maybe I'm just always interested in the UN is a club of member states, so it always has to respect member states. But what do you do when who's the legitimate leader? I mean, they deal with strongmen all over the world. There's no dispute that Kim Jong-il is the leader of North Korea. And so he gets letters from Ban Ki-moon that says, Your Excellency, you're excellent, But right now in Kenya, and especially, it's a UN hub, right? It's like the fourth biggest UN city. So in a way, they're almost, I'm sure somewhere in the UN, there are people arbitraging and trying to, but they both want to know, legitimately who's the leader. But there's also just the realpolitik of, if Kibaki's going to stay in control, do you want to have, distance yourselves from him for 2 weeks? So I don't know. That's my 2 cents.
I guess it's one of those things where if enough member states start to question Kibaki's legitimacy, then the UN sort of might follow. But it seems like this has happened in the past, or today with Taiwan. Where the UN can't recognize Taiwan because China won't let them. Meanwhile, other member states of the UN have bilateral relations.
Well, I don't know if portions of Kenya are going to break away with Odinga, but I know what you. No, absolutely. It actually made me think of Bush Gore in Florida. To be not obvious, I mean, there's many things that can be said. Obviously, things didn't.
Well, I think you make a good point because essentially this is a constitutional crisis in Kenya. It's not
like these people just wanting to kill each other based on old ethnic hatred.
And instead of like lawyers counting hanging chads, the problem is you have like machetes and sticks, and
Yeah, but we at least have a strong enough rule of law in our country.
There was some vandalism I think there was some vandalism of carpet bagging, pull counters cars, but scratching a key across somebody's rent-a-car is different,
Right. So what's next in your list there, Matthew?
I actually want. I'm going to be not didactic. I hope to engage you on an issue of UN transparency. It was announced.
Please.
It was announced now 8 days ago on a Thursday, so whatever that is, with some fanfare that the UN was unveiling the public financial disclosures done voluntarily of a number of senior UN officials. This is something that has been in evolution. It's required that all senior UN officials file a disclosure. It's always been kept secret in the past, and they file it with an outside firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers. And the goal of the filing is to make sure that they're not operating under a conflict of interest. Ban Ki-moon, actually we outed, I'll have to say, under the previous administration, Kofi Annan said he had met his obligation, but as it turned out, he hadn't filed financial disclosure because it only applies to staff, and he's not staff as the Secretary General.
Right.
After this came out, he filed his. Ban Ki-moon, to his credit, when he came in, said he was going to make his financial disclosure, or a portion of it, public. And he encouraged all of his assistant Secretary Generals and Undersecretary Generals. All told, it's 100. They say it's 190 individuals, although I can only find 170. There's some mystery ones, but about that number, that he encouraged them voluntarily to make their finances public. Here's what I can say. Despite them saying that this has now happened, a quarter of the officials to whom the request to make public disclosure was made have in fact disclosed.
Okay.
The question is,
how many is that?
So I guess what I want to, and I'm having a lot of, and then there's reporting about people that claim they reported, they didn't. Some people didn't turn in anything. Turns out 34 people didn't even do the private disclosure that they're required by law to do and haven't been disciplined. But I want to know what you, as a true believer, to put you in that box.
Right. A true believer in transparency?
In the UN. What do you think it says about the UN? And let me say that the public financial disclosure, number one, includes nothing about spouse and children and has no dollar figures in it. It literally is as simple. One guy, the head of the UN in Geneva, filed a form, the only line of which is, I have a bank account. And he's considered to have complied with voluntary public disclosure.
Yeah.
Other people, Iqbal Riza, who was a major figure in oil for food, filed a form that says, I choose to maintain confidentiality, and he's counted by the UN as participating in public disclosure because he filed that form. All right, ball's in your court. What do you say?
Well, I guess what it says principally is so what you're saying is that Ban Ki-moon just issued his own disclosure and encouraged his subordinates to issue their own, and not enough of them did that.
Yeah, a quarter of them.
A quarter of them. I guess. What to me it says is that the Secretary General sort of isn't empowered enough. That he doesn't really have much of an ability to hire and fire people as he chooses, and I think that's principally a problem. I mean, if he wanted to fire someone, because they didn't, fill out this form, he couldn't. I mean, he doesn't have much leverage over his staff.
He said, actually,
I'm just saying, as a chief executive, his hands are sort of tied, and that's, I think, an institutional problem.
His head of Department of Management, Alicia Barcena, said in a press conference earlier this year that people that didn't file the private financial disclosure, which is absolutely required, would be terminated.
Yeah.
But today I interviewed the head of the ethics office who said 34 people didn't file anything, even privately, and that he'd referred the names to something here called the Office of Human Resources Management. And I said, have any of them filed it or been disciplined? And he said, no. So I think that's not a lack, it's just a lack of constant focus, I guess. I don't know. I asked it today at a noon briefing. We'll see what's going to happen. But I think alternatively you could say it means Ban Ki-moon's not much of a leader because he said, follow me, and they said, screw you. But that's getting too personal.
But, you also need to be able to, turn the screws on people who don't follow you, and I just don't think he's empowered enough to do that. And I don't think any Secretary General is. Unfortunately, I think there was a big push in 2005 to empower the Secretary General to let him have more authority over management issues, and that
reform push was defeated.
What does it say? I guess this is more. Maybe I
Yeah.
should have been more pointed. I didn't mean what does it say about ban, because we can always go but return to that. It's an evergreen topic. But what does it say about the culture, to the degree you can generalize, the culture of the senior, many of them long-term senior bureaucrats and officials at the UN, that 75% of them, when called, forget whether it's Ban Ki-moon or not, to make the most minimal of public disclosures so that the public could rest assured that conflicts of interest were less likely,
Yeah.
refused to.
Well, it seems to me that they're not accountable to their boss.
Right.
And that's
Much less to the
that's
public.
principally the
Yeah,
problem.
or to any, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that seems to be the crux of the problem.
There's an interesting sidebar to this, which is that there are very few absolute prohibitions in the UN system, but one of them is that UN officials should not receive money from their governments, and this includes what's called housing subsidies. The idea that I think we may have talked about it before, of a UNDP official that was receiving $7,000 a month from the Dutch government, so that she could live in a nice apartment, even though she was making $225,000 a year. But the issue that's come up recently in these financial disclosures, they've said you don't have to disclose spousal information because it would violate your privacy. But it's turned out that there are several missions that pretty much consciously and intentionally hire the spouse of the UN official and pay them the housing subsidy. Get it? And and I spoke, the head of the ethics office today said, what are you going to do? It doesn't break the rule. So I said, what? If a mission said to you openly, we are going to hire the spouse of the official and pay them the $7,000, I guess he's saying that the rules would have to somehow be changed. I think somehow there has to be, and somebody else there, a major European power, what they do is they're smart enough that they wait until their official has finished UN service and then give them a kind of a lump sum payment, which the UN can't do anything about because the person's no longer a UN official. Maybe they should take away their pension. I don't know. I just think, and again, it's not to be a stickler, it's to say, the sine qua non of loyalty to international service is not being in the pay of one government, right? I don't know.
Sure. It just seems hard to me that sort of any institution could say who your spouse can and cannot.
Right.
Be.
No, I agree. There's some legitimate. If she was already working,
they're not like
there,
intelligence
absolutely.
officials.
But it can't be. I mean, for example.
Yeah. I also.
No,
sorry,
go
on.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. I was just going to say, in general, and I get the same. I have the same reaction when I see people sort of trashing American bureaucrats. These are people who devote their life to public service, who aren't paid $1 million, salaries, who go out and work for the public every day, and the same thing works at the UN
so you
as
feel
well.
This way about
folks
Dick Cheney?
who are oftentimes, putting away. Well, yes,
you
I
think
do.
Dick Cheney, let's say, if he had stock options in Halliburton, you have no problem. It's not a conflict. He's a hardworking civil servant that just should be allowed to do business on the side.
Well, listen, I think to the extent that he has his blind trust, which supposedly he does, I think that's in an acceptable sort of compromise.
All right, no,
because you don't want to prevent
I'm
people
liking your
from
fairness.
public
This
service,
is,
but you don't want them.
Thought,
well, you don't want. Yeah, I mean, you obviously.
No, I don't think I think highly. I sort of have you in this box of a very.
I respect people
just
who
because you're
devote their lives to
pro-UN
public
doesn't
service.
make you anti-Dick Cheney.
Like I said, I respect people who go into public service.
I do, but I respect them. But I think it's entirely fair that they be aggressively watchdog because I think, and I'll say this again: we've talked about Tony Blair before, and I'm sure he's working for the UN. He's now taken a second job. He already works for J.P. Morgan Chase for $1 million a year, £2 million a year now to advise Zurich Financial on climate change. I'm sure he's a master of the universe. I'm sure it's good advice he's giving. But I think it's fair, and not maybe you think it's being a hair shirt to say to the UN, could this be a conflict of interest to have people serving both the UN and particular financial institutions at the same time? I don't know if there should be a prohibition, but there's some people that, and I don't, is it a fair question? Is public service is it such a sacrifice that it's wrong to ask these kind of questions? That's sort of a setup.
No, it's not wrong because you're always wonder if people enter public service to enrich themselves and are corrupt. So it's important to obviously have folks that are watching.
I don't think that's the standard. Actually, I think the standard it's like the perception of conflict of interest. Like the system works because whether or not the judge is the fairest person in the world, they can't have a financial interest in something in front of them. If they do, they have to be recused. It's not saying that they're unfair people. It's just saying this is how the system works. And I think the same is true.
Yeah.
I mean, we can. Let's a topic that I know that has come up is the bombing of the UN building in Algiers.
Yeah.
This is kind of a stretch.
And here's a segue.
But,
yes. No, well, it's a potential conflict of interest.
Right. There you go.
Segue.
So this happened in December.
Yeah.
The terrorist car bombing in front of it. 17 UN staff members and many just Algiers citizens killed in the car bombing. The UN, Ban Ki-moon, pretty early on said he was going to appoint an outside panel to investigate how this happened. And also, how it could be avoided in the future. But in part, it's called an investigative panel. So there's a whole dispute about why did Algeria provide enough security? Did the UN not raise the threat level officially raise the threat level they were faced with, because the Algerian government likes to pretend that there's not dangerous terrorism in its backyard. There's a lot of things going on.
So there are questions that need to be answered on all sides.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ban Ki-moon recognized that, and to his credit, said he's going to appoint an outside panel to do it. The next day, the Algerian government said, "Not so fast. You can't. Right. We have our sovereignty. Who are you?" And it's an issue we talk about a lot. The UN apparently can't send peacekeepers into Darfur without the consent of al-Bashir. So Algeria says, "How can you send an investigative team without our consent?" Suddenly, there's chaos. They were supposed to announce the panel. They didn't announce it yet. There were démarches. The Algerian ambassador in New York at the UN met with the chief of staff Vijay Nambiar last Friday. Very cloak and dagger. No one would say what it was. In fact, Algeria was saying we're getting somewhere. It emerged yesterday that and this is Algerian deputy permanent representative saying it. So the UN has refused to confirm yet, but I feel it's been on Bloomberg, it's been on Inner City Press, so it's true, right?
Okay.
That the head of the panel is Lakhdar Brahimi, who is a UN diplomat, but in his prior life in the 90s was the foreign minister of Algeria. Over to you, Mark.
So just give some background on Lakhdar Brahimi. He's one of those sort of upper echelon UN envoys, sort of a super envoy in a way. One of his sort of most recent best accomplishments was securing the Iraq vote. So after Sergio Varela de Mello was killed in Iraq, Lakhdar Brahimi was sent there to try to mediate between al-Sistani, the Shiite cleric at the time, who wouldn't talk to the Americans, and based on Brahimi's work and mediation, the vote, the purple finger moment, if you recall, happened. So it was really the only sort of time that progress seemed possible in Iraq happened based on Brahimi's behind-the-scenes machinations and work to get this vote. Unfortunately, obviously progress hasn't sort of kept pace there. My personal opinion of Brahimi is that he's one of the world's most skilled diplomats and mediators. He's also the guy. He's known sort of most famously for the Brahimi Report, which was a report ordered in the year 2000, ordered by Kofi Annan to take a look at the peacekeeping failures of the 1990 in Rwanda and in Bosnia. And Brahimi came out with a series of recommendations that have since pretty much, but not entirely, been followed, and peacekeeping has improved dramatically since then. So I guess your question to me is it fishy that an Algerian is investigating what happened to the UN
Algeria when the allegation is that the government of Algeria didn't do enough, and they said, we're against the panel unless Algerian heads it.
I guess to me at least, Brahimi has this reputation beyond Algeria as sort of this UN thinker and as a real sort of no nonsense get things done kind of guy, that it's to me it seems that I wouldn't be worried.
Oh, right. I think
I understand that sort of investigating co-nationals might sort of appear to be a problem, but to me it seems like it'd be the best solution because they're obviously comfortable.
They are,
with
and the question is, what does that
like a UN guy.
Is that if he's so objective, the same concerns they might. If their concern is this wild card investigation that they don't know what it'll find out, why are they suddenly comfortable with Lakhdar Brahimi?
I guess. I'm curious to know, but maybe there isn't, that much to investigate. Maybe it seems hard that I honestly I have to admit ignorance. I really don't know why.
I think it's interesting. I'm not saying it's the world's biggest scam, but I think it's telling that. And again, it goes to this whole issue of like, what can the UN do and sovereignty and sort of tipping your hat. I have a kind of a cruel joke to say about this one, which is that comparing it to Pakistan and there was a lot of calls both by the party of Benazir Bhutto, but also other people saying that the UN somehow, some outside force, should investigate who killed Benazir Bhutto. That it wasn't credible to have the Musharraf government, who may have been involved, be the investigator. So there was a lot of calls, and the government of Musharraf said, no, without our consent, you can't do anything here. And the UN said, you're right, without your consent, we can't do anything there. Then he invited in some people from Scotland Yard. Some people would say that's as a fig leaf, to say it has an outside component, but it's not an outside investigation. And the difference, so the joke is, what's the difference between Ban Ki-moon and Pervez Musharraf? At least Musharraf brings in Scotland Yard. I don't know. This is what passes for UN humor. I'm sorry.
It passes. And you're not quite.
I know. No, I agree. Actually, I ascribe that to one wag. So I'm very sorry to say that.
Okay.
I know you're going, but I cannot resist. There's only a single, most important topic that must be broached, however briefly, and it is an erection, a construction that's taking place on the lawn of the United Nations. An enormous building is being built for a concert next week, Wednesday, to be sponsored by Gucci. And Gucci has said that this it's a huge building they're building. I mean, it's like a new UN, but it's a one-night only concert. But
it's like a tent.
It's not a tent. It's a solid structure with VIP tents around it, all of them heated and all of that. But no, it's a big building. It seats quite a few, and the tables are being sold for $25,000 apiece. So the question arose, what's going on with the use of UN land for Gucci? Well, it's not only Gucci, although Gucci has put out a press release saying that this event will celebrate its flagship store on Fifth Avenue. The event is Madonna. Madonna will perform. And the beneficiaries of the event, I know, everyone was. The beneficiaries of the event are 50% UNICEF, 50% an organization known as Raising Malawi, right? Malawi is where she in the disputed adoption procedure, blah blah blah.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So the first question to the UN is who's giving the space to Gucci's got its name all over the thing. So what's going on? They said
they're presumably they're putting out a lot of money for
advertising.
UNICEF and Raising Malawi.
In order to be able to say, okay, fine. The UN then won't answer those. It says you've got to ask UNICEF. UNICEF says no, we're a beneficiary, but it's not our concert. You've got to ask Raising Malawi. Raising Malawi, it turns out, hat tip to Fox News, is not incorporated as a not-for-profit. It's not a not-for-profit. It's run by the Kabbalah Center of Los Angeles. Okay. Okay,
which is probably, Madonna's church or synagogue or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. They say that very darkly, like the Kabbalah Center. I mean, I don't have...
I would assume, actually, the Kabbalah Center is probably a 501c3
nonprofit. I think their point is that there's not necessarily a nexus between the tables and Malawi. You know what I mean? So then there's a potential headline, of course, is raiding Malawi. But this is, I'll tell you, it's actually interesting. Some journalists here that normally don't get any investigative thing, there's something so wacky about the thing. And I think especially, I spoke again, maybe that's enough.
I will just interject. I will admit that it is wacky that Madonna is having a concert with Gucci at the UN.
Right.
But you have to keep in mind that UNICEF, they raise their money through voluntary contributions from member states and individual donations. People give money to UNICEF for them to allow them to do their work. It's not like
UNICEF has this thing called the USA Fund for UNICEF, right? That raises money for it in the U.S.
Yeah,
they do outrageous
UNICEF,
fundraisers all the time. They did one downtown Manhattan where they paid Snoop Dogg $100,000 to perform, and he actually smoked all this pot and played video games. It's a long story, but he performed, and Wall Streeters paid mucho dinero to go, and it was a funny story, but it wasn't really a UN story. They did it off premises, and it's sort of. But the idea is, I talked to a UNICEF senior official, let's put it that way, and said, why don't you just go the Snoop Dogg route, take it off my. They acknowledged that probably would have been a better route. They even said that they suggested that, but at a certain point, there was too much momentum. These Gucci and Madonna, or Gucci, had connections on the 38th floor. They got the land. UNICEF's going to get money and do good things with its 50%, and if the only ones opposing it, this guy said to me, are Fox News and Inner City Press, it's no problem for their brand. And so there you go. I'm sorry, maybe that's a very sad statement, but I think now the Italian wire service ANSA, following on the Inner City Press report, has written about it. And I think this guy also said, hey, the journalists who call me about this, all they want to do is attend the event. They really don't care about, So we'll see. Yeah. Maybe some of them will go, though, and see something so outrageous.
Maybe you'll attend the event. I'm actually be charmed.
I feel it's a conflict, actually, because the guy was like, "Do you want a ticket?" Okay. I'm like, "Well, once I've trashed the event enough, and then we'll see." Night of, but I really, it's weird. I don't know what the journalistic ethics of that are. I know that if you cover something, you're supposed to cover it, but it felt very much like, "Hey, what's behind all this? Is it that you want to go to the event?" And I could really take it or leave it. Actually, Chris Rock, Mark Anthony, there's a parade of stars.
Sounds like a fun. You shouldn't turn it down.
I don't know. I'm a hair shirt over here.
I think you should report back to us on Blog and Cats TV how the Madonna.
I like the idea better.
I think your audience on Blog and Cats.
We need some anti-corporate protesters. Some Gucci. I don't know if Gucci uses leather. So calling all PETA fans. UN February 6th. Come on down. All right.
There you go. All right, well, thank you very much, Matthew.
We've done the hype edition. From Clooney to Madonna, we've covered the UN.
We've got some serious topics in between. A little Kenya and
we've slipped
Gaza.
A little medicine in all the amus,
And all that. Great. Well, thank you very much, Matthew. I'll talk to you sometime very soon.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.